16,000 seats. A former NBA arena. Cameras rolling every single Sunday for a broadcast that reaches more American households than almost any other religious program in the country. For 25 years, Joel Osteen has been the most recognizable face of American Christianity. A smile so consistent it's practically a brand identity. But underneath the lights and the waterfalls in the lobby, Lakewood Church has spent the last several years fending off one uncomfortable story after another. A pandemic loan it didn't need to take. A hurricane it was accused of hiding from. A mass shooting that put a 7-year-old boy in intensive care. And a generation of Americans who increasingly don't share his optimism about organized religion. None of these stories, on their own, would sink a ministry this size. Together, they've chipped away at something harder to rebuild than a bank account. Public trust. Lakewood didn't start as a media empire. Joel's father, John Osteen, founded it in 1959 in a converted feed store in Houston after his daughter Lisa was born with a severe disability, and John left the Southern Baptist tradition to pursue what he described as a more charismatic, faith-healing-centered ministry. By the time Joel was a teenager, the church had grown into a congregation of several thousand. Joel himself never planned to preach. He studied radio and television at Oral Roberts University, dropped out after less than a year, and spent nearly 2 decades behind a camera producing his father's broadcasts rather than standing in front of one. That changed abruptly in January 1999. John Osteen asked his son to deliver a sermon. Joel finally agreed, and 6 days later John died of a heart attack. Joel inherited a congregation of roughly 6,000 members with essentially no preaching experience. What followed was one of the fastest growth curves in American religious history. Within 5 years, weekly attendance had climbed past 25,000. In 2003, Lakewood struck a deal with the city of Houston to lease and later purchase the Compaq Center, the former home of the Houston Rockets, spending tens of millions of dollars converting a basketball arena into what is now generally considered the largest single-campus church in the United States. With weekly attendance regularly cited around 40,000 to 45,000 people and television syndication reaching millions more. That scale is exactly why, when things go wrong at Lakewood, they don't stay local. The first major crack in Osteen's public image during this decade came during COVID-19. In 2020, Lakewood Church accepted roughly $4.4 million in Paycheck Protection Program funding, a federal loan program created to keep small businesses and nonprofits from laying off staff during pandemic shutdowns. According to reporting from the Houston Chronicle and the Houston Business Journal, Lakewood said the money went toward continuing full salaries and health benefits for its roughly 368 employees after in-person services had been shut down for months. The backlash was immediate and came from multiple directions. Watchdog groups like Americans United for Separation of Church and State argued that a religious institution, which is already tax-exempt and not required to disclose its finances the way secular nonprofits are, shouldn't also be drawing on a taxpayer-funded relief program designed for struggling small businesses. Critics also point to the optics. Osteen has been widely reported to live in a roughly $10.5 million Houston mansion, and his net worth has been publicly estimated by outlets including the Daily Beast at somewhere between $50 million and $100 million. A widely circulated claim that Osteen drives a $300,000 Ferrari was investigated and debunked by the fact-checking site Snopes. Worth noting, because not every rumor attached to a controversy this size turns out to be true. To Lakewood's credit, and something that often gets left out of the story, the church repaid the full loan in late 2021 after the criticism mounted, and a spokesperson maintained that none of the funds went to Joel or Victoria Osteen personally, both of whom have said they take no salary from the church. Still, the episode became a template for a broader question that keeps resurfacing. For an organization built around a message of abundance and generosity, why does it so often look like the money flows toward the institution's own visibility rather than outward? That question is harder to answer than it should be, and that's by design, not accident. Under U.S. law, churches are exempt from the financial disclosure requirements that apply to most other tax-exempt charities. They don't have to file the IRS Form 990 that lets the public see how a nonprofit spends its money. So when critics claim to know exactly what percentage of Lakewood's budget goes to missions versus media production versus overhead, those figures are difficult to independently verify against an audited public record. because in large part such a record doesn't exist for outside researchers to check. What is verifiable is the pattern this creates industry-wide. Watchdog organizations such as Ministry Watch have spent years pushing megachurches toward voluntary financial transparency precisely because so few are required to provide it. Lakewood is not uniquely opaque among American megachurches, but its size means any gap between its message of prosperity and its visible spending gets magnified. When a ministry built on the phrase, "your best life now," is also the subject of recurring stories about undisclosed finances, expensive real estate, and reluctance to open its books, skepticism isn't irrational. It's a predictable response to an information vacuum. If the PPP story dented Osteen's finances narrative, Hurricane Harvey damaged something more personal: the perception that Lakewood would show up for its own city in a crisis. When Harvey hit Houston in August 2017, flooding large parts of the metro area and displacing thousands of residents, Lakewood initially said its building was inaccessible due to flooding and safety concerns. Local residents and journalists quickly circulated photos and videos showing streets around the church that appeared dry, and the hashtag Open Lakewood Church spread rapidly on social media, drawn in part by comparisons to smaller local businesses, like a Houston mattress store, that had already opened their doors as shelters. Under mounting public pressure, Lakewood opened its facility as a shelter days into the crisis. The church later said the delay was tied to genuine internal flooding and city routing of shelter resources elsewhere, and it's worth acknowledging that assessing a 16,000-seat facility's usability in real time during an active flood event is a legitimately harder logistical call than a viral photo can capture. But the reputational damage was already done, and it created a lasting association, fair or not, between Osteen's ministry and the idea of a wealthy institution being slow to act when its own community needed it most. That association resurfaced again in 2025, when Hurricane Beryl knocked out power across the region. Lakewood distributed water and supplies, but some on social media said the response still felt smaller than what an organization of its size and visibility could offer. Then came the day that changed the conversation entirely. On February 11th, 2024, a 36-year-old woman named Janesse Yvonne Moreno walked into Lakewood Church carrying an AR-15 style rifle, a second firearm, and her 7-year-old son, Samuel. According to police accounts and reporting from Houston public media and the Associated Press, Moreno falsely claimed to be carrying a bomb, sprayed a substance on the floor, and opened fire in a hallway during the start of the Spanish-language service, wounding a 47-year-old bystander. Two off-duty officers working security, a Houston police officer and a Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission agent, returned fire and killed Moreno within minutes. In the exchange, her son Samuel was shot in the head. What emerged afterward was a portrait of a system that had multiple opportunities to intervene and didn't. Moreno had a documented history of schizophrenia and a criminal record, according to her former mother-in-law, Wally Carranza, who told reporters she had unsuccessfully petitioned for conservatorship of Samuel during a contentious custody battle in 2022. Despite that history, Moreno legally purchased a rifle in December 2023. Texas has no red flag law that would have allowed courts to temporarily remove firearm access from someone with their documented mental health record. Investigators also said they found anti-Semitic writings connected to Moreno and a sticker referencing Palestine on her weapon, and suggested the attack may have been tied to a family dispute involving her ex-husband's Jewish relatives, though a definitive motive has never been officially confirmed. Samuel's injuries were severe. His grandmother said doctors removed a significant portion of his skull across multiple emergency surgeries, and that he went through repeated cardiac arrests in the days after shooting. He came off a ventilator roughly 2 weeks later. As of early 2025, the case had been referred to a Harris County grand jury to review whether the responding officer's use of force was justified, a standard process for any officer-involved shooting, not an indication of wrongdoing by itself. In the aftermath, Osteen addressed his congregation directly, visibly emotional, urging the church toward faith and forward momentum rather than dwelling on the tragedy. Some congregants found comfort in that response. Others, including gun safety advocates and members of Samuel's extended family, argued that a moment this serious called for the platform Osteen commands, millions of viewers, a direct line to national media, to be used to push for concrete policy change, like stronger red flag laws or better coordination between mental health systems and child welfare agencies. Whether or not that criticism is fair to a pastor whose job is fundamentally spiritual rather than legislative, it reflects a broader tension that follows Osteen everywhere. An audience this large comes with an expectation of influence, and people disagree sharply about how or whether he should use it. Underneath all of these individual controversies sits a longer-running argument about what Osteen actually preaches. Osteen is closely associated with the prosperity gospel, the broad theological position that says genuine faith should manifest in visible blessing, financial success, physical health, personal happiness. He has said publicly that he believes God's will includes people paying their bills without being in debt and living in good health. Critics inside evangelical Christianity have been pointed about this for years. Theologians such as Michael Horton have described prosperity teaching as a distortion of core Christian doctrine, and other prominent evangelical voices have argued that preaching centered on self-improvement and positivity, without much emphasis on sin, repentance, or the more difficult parts of Christian theology, risks becoming what one critic memorably called cotton candy faith, pleasant, easy to consume, and short on substance. Osteen has responded to versions of this criticism for 2 decades, including in a well-known 2012 conversation with Oprah Winfrey, generally arguing that his approach is about meeting people where they are rather than leading with condemnation. This isn't a debate with a factual right answer. It's a genuine disagreement about what a church's job should be, and reasonable people, including plenty of practicing Christians, land on very different sides of it. But it matters for the larger story here, because it shapes how each new controversy gets read. A pastor known primarily for sermons about hope and blessing faces a sharper contrast than most when the headlines involve federal loans, real estate, and gun violence. The gap between the message and the moment becomes a story itself. Reporting on Osteen's troubles often leans on a claim that young Americans are abandoning churches like his in record numbers, and for a long time that was a reasonably fair characterization of the data. Pew Research and Gallup surveys tracked a real, sustained decline in religious affiliation and attendance among millennials and Gen Z through the 2010s and into the early 2020s, alongside a broader national rise in Americans who identify with no religion at all. But the more recent numbers complicate that narrative in a way worth being upfront about. Barna Group's 2025 State of the Church research, conducted with the church technology company Glue, found that Gen Z and millennial churchgoers are now attending more frequently than they have at any point since Barna began tracking the trend, roughly twice a month on average, nearly double their attendance frequency from 2020. And for the first time in decades, younger adults are outpacing older generations in how often they show up. Older generations, meanwhile, have seen their own attendance frequency decline over the same 25-year period. Pew's separate polling still shows lower overall religious affiliation among the young, compared with previous generations at the same age. So the full picture is genuinely mixed. Fewer young Americans identify as religious at all, but the ones who do attend church appear to be showing up more often than skeptics assumed. What that means for Lakewood specifically isn't something the available research answers directly. Nobody has published independent attendance audits of a single Houston megachurch broken down by generation. What can be said honestly is that the sweeping claim that young people are simply walking away from churches like Osteen's is now more complicated than it was even 3 or 4 years ago, and any script that tells you otherwise with total confidence is oversimplifying. None of the individual controversies attached to Joel Osteen, the loan, the hurricane response, the shooting, the theological criticism, amount of proof of wrongdoing on his part personally. He returned the PPP money. Lakewood did eventually open during Harvey. The 2024 shooting was carried out by someone with a documented history of mental illness who legally obtained a firearm under a state law critics say is too permissive. Not a failure Osteen himself is directly responsible for. And prosperity theology, whatever you think of it, is a legitimate, long-standing strand of American Protestant thought with millions of adherents who find real comfort in it. What all these stories share, though, is a pattern. An organization built almost entirely around image, media reach, and a message of unbroken positivity keeps running into moments that are messy, tragic, or financially uncomfortable, and each time, the instinct from Lakewood's leadership has been project calm and move forward rather than open the books, answer hard questions directly, or sit with the discomfort in public. That approach has worked for Osteen for a quarter century. Whether it keeps working in an era where audiences increasingly expect institutions, religious or otherwise, to answer for themselves in detail, rather than simply reassure, is the real question hanging over Lakewood Church heading into its next decade. Sources referenced: Houston Chronicle/Houston Business Journal reporting via Forbes, The Daily Beast, and Religion Unplugged PPP Loan. Snopes, Ferrari Rumor. Wikipedia, Houston Public Media, Fox News, and the Christian Post 2024 shooting. Barna Group/Religion News Service, Pew Research Center, and Gallup Church Attendance Trends 2025.